Year 10 and 11, welcome to your analysis of the poem The Charge of the Light Brigade by Alfred Lord Tennyson in preparation for your AQA poetry exam. The context of the poem. As you can see on this slide, the Crimean War was fought between Britain and Imperial Russia from 1853 to 1856. For the first time in history, newspapers carried eyewitness reports as well as detailing not just the triumphs of war, but the mistakes and horrors as well. The most significant moment in the Crimea came during the Battle of Balaclava. An order given to the British Army's cavalry division, known as the Light Brigade, was misunderstood, and 600 cavalrymen ended charging down a narrow valley straight into the fire of Russian cannons. Over 150 British soldiers were killed and more than 120 were wounded. At home, the news of the disaster was a sensation, and a nation that had until then embraced British military exploits abroad began to question the politicians and generals who led them. The Charge of the Light Brigade. Half a league, half a league, half a league onward, all in the Valley of Death, rode the 600. Forward the Light Brigade, charge for the guns, he said. Into the Valley of Death rode the 600. Forward the Light Brigade. Was there a man dismayed? Not though the soldier knew. Someone had blundered. There's not to make reply, there's not to reason why, there's but to do and die. Into the Valley of Death rode the 600. Cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon in front of them, volleyed and thundered, stormed out with shot and shell. Boldly they rode and well. Into the jaws of death, into the mouth of hell, rode the 600. Flashed all their sabres bare, flashed as they turned in air, sabring the gunners there. Charging an army while, all the world wondered, plunged in the battery smoke, right through the line they broke. Cossack and Russian reeled from the sabre stroke, shattered and sundered, then they rode back, but not the 600. Cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon behind them, volleyed and thundered, stormed out with shot and shell, while horse and hero fell. They that had fought so well came through the jaws of death, back from the mouth of hell. All that was left of them, left of 600. When can their glory fade? Oh, the wild charge they made, all the world wondered. Honour the charge they made, honour the Light Brigade, noble 600. First, we will analyse the structure of the poem. Those students aiming for an A and an A star should be looking at the terminology used on the following slide. So the poem is comprised of 6 numbered stanzas varying length from 6 to 12 lines. Each line is in dimeter, which means it has 2 stressed syllables, and each stressed syllable is followed by 2 unstressed syllables, making the rhythm dactylic. Okay? The use of this falling rhythm, in which the stress is on the first beat of each unit and then falls off for the rest of the metre, is appropriate in a poem about the devastating fall of the British Brigade. For instance, half a league, half a league. You can hear that stressed, those 2 stressed syllables at the beginning of each line and how it trails off. It could also signify the fact that the soldiers initially go charging into this battle because obviously they've been misled, and that a lot of them die because of the fact that they are outnumbered. For a slightly easier interpretation of structure, you might want to look at this slide instead, or in addition to the slide that was before. So the poem has a strong rhythm, as we discussed. For example, half a league, 2 light beats followed by a heavy beat expresses the sound of the horses galloping. There are 6 numbered stanzas, as if each stanza is a memorial stone to 100 of the 600 cavalrymen. The length of the stanzas reflect the structure of the story. The first 3 stanzas are the Light Brigade approaching the guns. There is a strong structure. 3 lines of 3, 6 to 7 syllables are followed by a shorter line of 5 syllables, wrote the 600. This pattern suggests the strong formation in which the cavalry charge. In addition to that, if you're looking at something like regular stanzas, again, you can argue that mimics or represents, the strong military formation that the cavalry have used. In stanza 2, the Light Brigade has engaged the enemy, so the longer stanzas describe the struggle. The structure starts to break down. The rhythm of stanza 4, for example, is broken by 4 shorter lines, while stanza 5 has only 2 short lines. The desperate attempt to retreat is expressed in the run of 6 longer lines. Stanza 6 is a short, sharp conclusion written as if they are the lines we should remember the Light Brigade by. For an easy interpretation of one of the structural devices Tennyson uses, he occasionally uses rhyming couplets. Again, when we're doing poetry, it's your interpretation as to why he uses rhyming couplets. You might want to be talking about, that regular beat, the horse's gallop. It's another way of showing that. You might want to be talking about the two sides engaged in the battle, for instance. Again, it is your interpretation of why Tennyson has decided to use rhyming couplets. I think the rhyming couplets also add an inevitability, the inevitability of death, especially in a war zone. Tennyson has used a ballad format here, and by using the poetic form of a ballad, it clearly identifies that Tennyson is telling the story of the charge, and ballads will often have a tragic ending, and it is therefore fitting for this particular poem. The refrain used, "Rode the 600, rode the 600, noble 600. This refrain emphasises the number of soldiers involved in the cavalry charge, highlighting the large number that risked their lives in the name of their country. The poem begins in media res, and that means in the middle of something. So the poem begins immediately, and it creates excitement and the exhilaration of the cavalry charge. The reader is plunged straight into the action of the poem. So just to clarify the term at the bottom there, because I don't know if you will have heard of it, in media res means in the middle of something, and that is how the poem begins. If we start our analysis of language now, obviously straight away you've got all this repetition of half a league, half a league, half a league. Tennyson uses repetition throughout. Later on, cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon in front of them. This repetition adds to the idea that the men are peppered by the Russians, that they can't avoid being annihilated, especially when they are heavily outnumbered. You could also argue that Tennyson's use of repetition is quite clever in the sense that there's an undertone there of the idea that war is a repetitive cycle in modern day society. We've been through quite a few wars, and we're still in conflict with others. So repetition is the idea that war, I suppose, is inevitable, which is, again, adds quite a sad tone to the poem. But again, what I said earlier, it's this idea that they can't avoid the Russians, they are heavily outnumbered, that they are being annihilated from all angles, especially in stanza 3. Cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon in front of them. And the stress on the word cannon there shows you just how futile their attempts are. If we carry on down stanza 1, you have got one of the most important metaphors, I think, in the entire poem, all in the Valley of Death. The Valley of Death we know as a biblical reference, the shadow of the Valley of Death. And this metaphor shows us that death is inevitable for the cavalrymen. The 600 men that have ran into this battle not realising what they're facing, and a lot of them were killed and a lot of them were wounded. So the Valley of Death is metaphorically representing the inevitability that they are going to lose this battle and possibly their lives. Rode the 600. Forward the Light Brigade, charge for the guns, he said. We get some speech there. I suppose in many ways the speech adds a kind of realistic tone and angle to the poem where we get the actual words of the soldiers. And remember, I said on one of my first slides that it was one of the first occasions that a war had been reported on in detail. So what people were saying would have been reported. If you want to go extra with your analysis there, you've got the pronoun he, and the pronoun he is anonymous. It's as if we don't know who he is. It's almost as if we don't need to know who he is. There's almost not that connection there, which again links to the sadness of the poem, that we don't know who's died for us, or who's ran into this battle for us. And then we get the repetition of that wonderful metaphor of into the valley of death. The repetition of into the valley of death is again Tennyson hammering home that they cannot win, that they have lost before they've started, really. Stanza 2. Forward the Light Brigade. Again, it's an order, isn't it? It's a direct order. It's an imperative, really, isn't it? That they have to follow their orders. Forward the Light Brigade. It's speech again. Was there a man dismayed? Rhetorical question. Again, the reader here or the listener, we are forced to wonder: were they dismayed that they were misled? They probably were, but I think duty will have overtaken that, and that they've given their lives for the duty of the cause, I suppose. Not though the soldier knew someone had blundered. So that's the idea, that the soldiers didn't know that someone had made a mistake, and the word blundered there is massive. If you make a blunder in a war zone, you are responsible for the death of people, for people's lives. So big word there in the idea of blundered. There's not to make reply, there's not to reason why, there's but to do and die. Again, we've got this repetition by Tennyson again, and it's the idea that they don't disagree with orders, they don't question orders, they follow orders, and they don't reason as to what's going on or who's made this mistake and who has sent us here. What they do is they put their lives on the line for us, and that therein lies the heroic element of the poem, and the word hero is mentioned later on, which we'll come to. If we're talking about emotive language, we've had death and we've had die, so again you've got that emotive tone running through, because naturally the reader/listener will feel sympathy for the soldiers. Okay. Repetition of into the valley of death we discussed earlier. Cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon in front of them. Again, we discussed the idea that the soldiers have been ambushed here. Volleyed and thundered, stormed out with shot and shell. Look at your alliteration there. Stormed out with shot and shell. It's brutal. It's unavoidable that they are being bombarded by bullets, by the cannon. Boldly they rode and well. If we look at the adverb boldly, again, it's that heroic element again, isn't it? That they were so brave and so bold to ride straight into death, which is obviously our big metaphor. We have some wonderful personification at the end there, into the jaws of death. Again, it links to into the valley of death, and it's this wonderful image of when they ride into the valley, it's got jaws, because it's almost a trap, which links to the cannons surrounding them. And remember, jaws, it sounds silly, but I always think of a shark when I think of giant jaws. I know that sounds silly, but my point is that it's deadly, and that it's deathly, and that they can't escape. Okay? Tennyson decides to use imagery at the start of stanza 4 there, so the reader can picture, exactly what's going on with the action there, as the soldiers have their sabres bare, flashed as they turned in air, sabring the guns there, repetition of blashed and sabres again, charging an army while all the world wondered, plunged in the battery smoke, plunged again. It's that idea that they were thrown into the action, much like the reader is, because of the use of in media res. If we look further down that stanza, you've got reeled from the sabre stroke, shattered and sundered. Alliteration. The alliteration in the poem signifies the barrage of assault from the Russian cannons, and is contrasted by the flashing of the sabres of the Light Brigade. So we hear that the Light Brigade are flashing their swords, but what we hear of the Russians is that is the cannons and the shattering and the sounds of the fact that the British men are being bombarded here. And then they rode back, but not the 600, and that the tone almost changes in the poem there, because obviously we know now that the soldiers or the cavalry have lost quite a lot of men. We've got the repetition of the cannons again, which we discussed earlier. Volleyed and thundered, stormed out with shot and shell. Again, that sound imagery shows us the constant attack of the Russians here. Horse and hero fell. The alliteration of the H there, I suppose, makes the line more poignant. Hero Tennyson has chosen to focus on the heroic aspect of the poem, rather than the error that someone has made sending the 600 cavalry into this battle. Came through the jaws of death, back from the mouth of hell. So we have the repetition of that image I discussed earlier, and that personification, the jaws of death. But when we get back from the mouth of hell, it's the idea that some of them have survived. It's a relief for the reader and the listener. Mouth of hell, again, when we're talking about personification, images or metaphor, it's this association of a monster, and the idea that what has happened here is a monstrosity, isn't it? It's awful. So also the mouth of hell has that devilish type of connotation associated with it, especially when we hear hell. It also doesn't show the reader, but it suggests to the reader that the men have suffered greatly. All that was left of them, left of the 600. I discussed pronouns earlier, and you've got them. Again, it's anonymous. It's almost detached. It's as if we don't know who they were, and they have died for us. We get the end then. When can their glory fade? Oh, the wild charge they made. All the world wondered. So glory, when will their glory fade? Rhetorical question. It makes the reader think, will we forget what these men have done, or actually will we remember? Well, because of Alfred Lord Tennyson's poem, we will remember the 600. All the world wondered, got alliteration and the idea of wonder. Honour the charge they made, honour the Light Brigade, noble 600. So repetition of honour and the idea of nobility at the end there. So as I said earlier, there's only one line in the whole poem that is dedicated to the error that someone has made, and that is someone has blundered. So there's only one line in the whole poem because Lord Tennyson has decided to provide the poem with a proud tone. He is honouring the bravery of the soldiers all the way through till the very end, when we hear that they are noble. So final summing up of language then. We've got boldly, glory, honour, noble. So language that evokes a sense of bravery. There's not to make reply. Use of anaphora to emphasise the immensity of the charge. I shall explain anaphora on the next slide, so bear with me. Flashed all their sabres, stormed out with shot and shell. We discussed the alliteration to imitate the violence of the battle and the fact that the Russian army is bombarding our soldiers with the cannons, with the shots, with death, I suppose. So as I said, the words of bravery highlight the pride that Tennyson has and the country has in the soldiers. He admires their bravery, obviously, and shows it in the poem. Anaphora, as I mentioned earlier, okay? Anaphora is the repetition of phrases at the beginning of lines. So he does that a lot, doesn't he? Half a league or cannon to the right of them. Is used to highlight the relentless nature of the attack. By repeating theirs, the reader is focused on the soldiers of the Light Brigade as a unit rather than individuals, and the repetition of cannon indicates how they were outnumbered by superior firepower. Okay, so again, your A and your A star student, your number 8 and your number 9 should be using terms such as anaphora, poetic terminology, okay? I mentioned this image earlier, but again, the allusion to the Bible, and Psalm 23 highlights the faith and courage shown by the soldiers. It's about having faith in God during times of extreme uncertainty, and is often read out at funerals. If you're again wondering what line I mean, it is into the valley of death. And to finish, just to repeat what I said earlier, rather than criticise the strategic error of the commanding officers, Tennyson has chosen to focus on the heroics of the soldiers fighting bravely in the face of certain death. The poem is a memorial to the Light Brigade and glorifies the sacrifice they made.